I just wanted an interesting title in terms of what I'm talking about this morning, because it says, Culture and Leadership Dimensions of Valuing Female Talent. And it's always struck me as an interesting debate that we keep having to push the agenda of saying, why aren't women being recognised and valued in organisations? And I just want to trot back a little bit through history and argue that actually our organisations, all of them, have been so distorted by that failure to understand humanity, whether it's in gender, race or anything else, that it's only finally catching up in recognising what do we do about that distortion. So for those of you who've done your DMSs and your Masters and all the rest of it, you'll go back about 100 and odd years. Frederick Taylor, anybody remember Frederick Taylor? So when kind of business life started, in terms of our understanding of business life, the understanding at the time was that you didn't have any dimension that recognised anything to do with being a human being. So if you could just sort and work through what was the best way to get a production unit by turning on the lights, by creating job descriptions, we've still got job descriptions, all those sorts of things, then somehow or other you would get the best production. And he was very famously against any humanist idea that being who you were had anything to do with work. All of that then trots through. Everybody remember the Hawthorne experiments? So the Hawthorne experiments were based on the idea of if you could go along and look at a group of people and you could observe them and keep changing things like the lighting, the heating, the space that they are in, you would get more production from those various units, as they were called. And what they started to realise that over time, when you were observing these people, that you actually were getting differences in some kind of production. And of course, finally the light bulb moment went on, and they recognised it was nothing to do with what they were changing in the factors, it was the fact that they were being observed as human beings that was having an impact. And that started, finally, a sense of that being human had something to do with how you related to work. Then you went through a whole phase in the sort of 30s, 40s and 50s, where people were starting to really think about, well, what is leadership? What's it all about? I worked for British Airways for a time when I was in consultancy, and I remember reading some of the kind of back history about leadership. And over the decades, over the centuries, our understanding of the traits of leadership have been fascinating. So at one point, being short was considered a really key factor in being a good leader. Bonaparte, all those sorts of people. And there are actually dissertations written about, it's a nightmare if you're 6 foot, obviously, but it was considered being short was very much part of being a leader. This gave way, interestingly, in the 40s and 50s and 60s, that height was very much about being a leader. And to be tall was considered that. Also, which hair colour do you reckon? Just give me a shout out whether blonde or dark made a difference to your being a leader. Dark. So in the 1950s or 60s, 70s, when you see the BOAC adverts, you had all these various men striding through airports, carrying cabin bags. I used to be married to a pilot many years ago. It was a disaster. But he carried through these bags, and they were all tall and dark. And where it had come from is because the images from Hollywood were about tall, dark men, that in a sense people felt that they were less likely to crash out the sky if it was being driven by a tall, dark man. And they did loads of research at the time that people did feel a sense of trust, and less trust if it was a blonde man who was the pilot. They did ratings on airplanes about their feeling of orientation as a pilot. So there was a whole school of argument for a long time, but for a good 20, 30 years, about what you looked like was very fundamental to how you were as a leader. And really sadly, a lot of that stuff still prevails. They've just done research in America, and they were talking to female leaders about who they would recruit in terms of women. So they started with gender, and they made the assumption that on the whole, it wouldn't matter what women looked like to women. And what they found, staggeringly, is that women are far more likely to recruit women who they perceive to be attractive as opposed to the other. And then you have the whole argument about if you want to look thin, hang around with a lot of fat people. But nonetheless, the idea was they really did assume that. But they would typically bring in attractive women because the psychology of it is that it endorses your worth if you are surrounded by very attractive people. Because seemingly you are part of a gang that is very attractive. So they were deliberately not recruiting women they perceived to be not attractive, and sadly not within a certain age range. Because after a certain age, and I'm not sure now when you were not perceived to be particularly attractive. This is a research from about a year ago. So there's still that predominating worry about the fact that what you look like actually does have a difference in who you are. And rather sadly, people still say to me, you must really got to be the chief exec because you're 6 foot. And you think, okay, well, I'm glad it had nothing to do with having a brain or anything like that. It was just that you looked vaguely authoritarian. Although interestingly, one of my things as a chief is that I never wear a suit. Never wear anything that kind of gives over a sense of authority, because I already know that at 6 foot, you're struggling with to a certain extent, not looking authoritarian. And if I put my hair up, I'm about 6'2", so I'm always slightly inside. But the whole thing about how you look like predominated for a long time. You then finally get into the kind of 70s, 80s, and then it became very much about traits, that you had to have certain traits in order to be a good leader. And some of you will remember this. So all of a sudden you had to be charismatic, and no doubt if you're old enough you've been on courses where people were talking about putting up various posters of people like Richard Branson. I am told on very good authority he is a nightmare person to work for. He's quite a bully. And people about his PA I used to know. But nonetheless, and somebody must have been on a course where you had who are the leaders that you can talk about, and Richard Branson came up, and it was all meant to be about these charismatic leaders. Anybody want to define me what charisma is? No, because nobody's got a clue what it is. So, because on the whole, when you actually, if you can recognise charisma, and sometimes you can, you know, the bloke I was seeing a little while ago, I thought, oh, he's cute, and he's got something about him. And there's a sort of something about himness that you might define as charisma, but usually it's sex. So there's a whole kind of thing about worrying about what that is. But I remember going on our first leadership course years ago thinking, have I got charisma? Have I not? What does that work? Do I need to be, and all these people went through a whole era of leadership training worrying about whether they had these particular traits. And I might add, a load of leadership training was very focused on the idea that you were going to be trained to have these traits. And if you didn't own them personally, what you ended up with a load of people who looked quite uncomfortable in their leadership roles, because they weren't really behaving as they were as human beings. They were being taught how to behave as a leader. And one of the things I think there's always been a misery for men is that somehow or other they had to appear to be butch and charismatic and strong and authoritarian, where I dare say it's true for most male leaders that there are times to be the same as me, when you're sitting at your desk thinking, I haven't got a clue what to do, I don't know how to do that, but they're not allowed to represent that because they're meant to be a certain way. So I think the problem for all of us, in a sense, through the whole history of management, leadership, organisational life, is that whilst that's had, I think, to a certain extent, a marked effect in terms of women, it's had an equally marked effect on men. And we ran a wellbeing seminar last year. And one of the things, we have mostly men in the room, that we were trying to explore is that men not talking to each other, or not talking at all about their issues, is a really, really difficult thing. Not least because of the mental ill health issues that come with it. The highest rate of suicide, sadly, in this country is between 45 and 53 men. And even on Radio 4 talking about this issue the other day. So the distortion in how organisations run have an impact on women, but they equally have an impact on men in different ways, because of what you're meant to be. So all the way through that, women have had this what you're meant to be. But of course, if you're having an image that says you're meant to be tall, dark and handsome, and you're meant to be authoritarian, and you're meant to do all these certain types of traits, women were never going to have a chance in that kind of era to be seen as anything other than somebody in the office. So, and because you then have all this, we all swap stories, I've got no doubt, about various things that have happened over the years. So when I was about 35, 36, my hair was a bit longer. And the marketing manager in the organisation I worked at the time said to me, if you ever want to be treated seriously, you need to cut your hair off. You need to have short hair to be seen, yeah? And I remember looking at it and thinking, but it's the only thing I've got that makes me look all right. I'm just going to, what am I going to do? Cut my hair off? And I remember going on being quite upset about thinking, is that true? Is that not true? And I thought, well, sorry then, I'm not going to be seen yet because I like my hair. So it ended up just being a really interesting dynamic. We all had the being chased around the table thing, certainly when I was younger, not so much lately, sadly. But nonetheless, those kind of dynamics about being seen as asexual, I mean being seen as sexual, being seen as something who is not as intelligent, and being seen as something that cannot be a leader because you don't conform to the criteria that define leadership. So on that basis, you were never going to end up in management or leadership positions because the traits and characteristics of that era wouldn't have defined you as a leader. And I think tragically that is also true for men to a certain extent. So men who are seen as having more emotional intelligence, who are more emotionally articulate to a certain extent, would also be being seen as somebody who wasn't necessarily going to be a good leader. And it's only in the last few years that we're finally moving into, which is hopefully and false dawns are always there, but hopefully in terms of the broad stuff about organisational history, we're moving into an era of authentic leadership. And people talk a lot of rubbish about authentic leadership, because sometimes you think, well, what does authentic leadership look like? Is yet another sort of fairly difficult model to get on with. But I think what it's meant for a lot of people is that it's finally okay in organisational life to be who you are. And I think we're finally getting to a place where being who you are might define you being really good as somebody in the organisation. And that's taken 120 years of managerial theory. So if you're going on courses now about management and leadership and all those sorts of areas, hopefully that some of the dynamics that are starting to be talked about aren't about you have to be a thing that you cannot be. It's about much more, what is it I've actually got? And what have I got that goes there? Which brings a whole other set of problems. And what's really interesting now, and I'm speaking as a psychologist for a second, one of the things that starts emerging, and I think rather sadly more for women sometimes than men, but not always, is if you have to be who you are, most people struggle with self-worth. They struggle with self-esteem. They struggle with, well, what is my image? What is it that I'm actually giving to the organisation? Because if it really is just about me, not pretending to be anything other than me, what happens for a lot of people, me included, is that you actually struggle with feeling it's okay to be you. And I've talked to so many women. I used to run assertion courses a lot of the time in other lives, and sadly seeing extraordinary people who defeat themselves because of that issue around assertion, self-worth, and building up the toolkit that actually makes you a good manager, just a good professional, never mind a manager, just a good professional. So I think when you come to authentic leadership, some of those other values start to appear about, well, how do you actually really support people to be who they are in the workplace and feel comfortable with that, recognising that they may be different from lots of other people. So if you think about it, we've spent a whole lifetime trying to get people to conform. All the management stuff that people have done is about conformity. Frederick Taylor backwards, job descriptions, all of that. Somebody must have been interviewed and asked what their weaknesses were. Can you ask what your weaknesses were? Oh, that's good. Some years. Used to be the case, so certainly up until about 10 years ago, every single interview you went in there and what was your strength and what was your weakness. There is no value at all in asking somebody what their weakness is, because it doesn't make any difference. And in fact, a lot of the recruitment stuff nowadays is about strengths-based recruitment. Recruit people because they have certain strengths and then build on them. Don't try and find out what they're not good at, because you will never remedially train anybody after they get to a certain age. So the idea of being able to say to people, let's actually take you on for what you are and then build you up. So when you come to some of the toolkit stuff, and I'm recognising your program is thinking about toolkits, some of the work that we've been trying to do, and some of the work just in private life, still do tiny bits of consulting around occupational health, is thinking about how do you actually support people as they start to become senior professionals, managers, leaders, in thinking about what their self-worth is, and actually how they then build those toolkits. And it's quite hard, because you really sometimes have to go back down to the bottom for a lot of people because of how they feel. Not least because when they're in organisational life, they will still perceive, if you're in an organisation that doesn't recognise that you're still fighting to be understood. You're still fighting to say, but it's all right to be different. And I think, certainly when I became chief, it's an interesting journey, because I joined as HR director, and I shared this on Monday, so I'll repeat it again, sorry about the language here. But I joined as HR director, and my brother died the day I joined, literally. So it was all very grim, as you would imagine. And 4 weeks later, the guy I was seeing got killed in a car crash. So it was a really miserable period of my life. And in fact, it was one of our crews that went to get him out of the car. So it was really rubbish. About 3 weeks after that, it was very, very obvious 8 years ago that the financial stuff was coming. So I said in a meeting, and we had 2 directors there who were just vile, that I really didn't think we should do a new recruit course. Because I said, no, it should be in there a few weeks. And this kind of big heated round, what did I know? You're an what did I know about any of this? And this guy lost his temper and called me a C-U-N-T. It's really, I just remember sitting there thinking, I'm sure I've been called that privately many times, but I don't think I've ever been called that to my face in a senior meeting in the organisation. So I just remember saying to him something about, well, A, it was hard not to cry, obviously, because you're not used to being treated like shit completely when you're in a management meeting. And I think I just remember saying something about, God, I'm astonished. I said, I've just come from a London borough, that it was very PC, and I'd worked for other London boroughs, done consulting. I said, you just wouldn't use any of that kind of language. You certainly wouldn't use that word, but you wouldn't use any of that language. And I said to him, I'm really astonished. I said, this is fire, is it? This is what it's like to work here. That it's okay to call a woman that in front of other people, even privately it would be outrageous, but to do that. I said, okay, well, we'll leave it there, shall we? And I walked out of the room, went to the toilet, cried, obviously, and then came back and thought, you've got to go. So I remember talking to the chief at the time and saying, right, I'm going to start scripting you an exit route for this guy. If he thinks he can do that, and then talk to other people and thinks he can do that, he's got to go. And it took a few months, but we got rid of him. And so loads of people went on the station saying, oh, you got rid of this person. And I said, yeah, I'm proud to do it. You knew he was a bully. He's been a bully to everybody for years. How can you be getting that worried about the fact that I have been seen to get rid of this person? And that first entrance into fire, and I thought, right, we're really not a woman-friendly organisation, are we? We don't get what it's like to be different at all. And then I think it's been part of my mission, not just to try and think about what's it like to be a woman in this organisation, but what's it like to be human in this organisation? What's it like to be who you are in this organisation? And to be more and more okay with being who you are. And I think that is just as true for men to a certain extent, but women sadly have had a history, because of that organisational history, where the idea that we have to fight to recognise talent is mad. We've been distorting organisational life for years because we haven't recognised it. Some of the best people in the world that we could have recruited into organisations because they were not perceived to be the right fit. And I remember the first day I became chief, February the 1st, I was interviewed by the BBC, and all blooming day they were saying, what's it like to be a woman then? What's it like to be a woman? What's it like to be a wee female chief? And in the end I said, well, I don't know what it's like to be a male chief, in truth, so I've no idea. I can't tell you the answer to that. All I can tell you about is what it's like to be a chief. That we've got loads of problems, loads of issues, loads of fantastic stuff, and along with a really, really excellent team, we're going to crack on. And in the end, they said, can you not talk a bit more about it? And then started to say to me, what's it like to be surrounded by all these men? And there was a little bit of, you know, are they all gorgeous, written in the question. Answer, no. Obviously company excluded, but not the whole thing about... And it was a long road, and it is still a long road, to try and move to this place where it's just okay to be who you are. And I spend lots and lots of time having conversations with, not about, because you get stuck into the processy policy areas about how do you do flexible working, how do you allow childcare, all of those sorts of things are true. At its heart, isn't it about what's the best way to get the best out of this person? So I'm always saying to people, right, I don't want people working at the weekends, and I'm just as bad at it, and I'm sending a signal about working on Sunday afternoons, and I've just stopped. And I said, right, that's it, we can't do it. We're sending signals to each other that it's okay to work on the weekends. We're sending signals to each other that it's okay not to have lunch times. Remember last time I got lunch out. We're sending signals to each other that it's okay to work to the exclusion of relationship. And we had this conversation about 2 or 3 years ago. That's not it. We're going to have times where we just have a chat and a laugh, and we make no excuse for that. And we're going to talk and have a look around. And I'm going to flirt with people, and I'm going to demand that people hug me every now and again. And I do that very publicly, so that there's a guy who is my kind of corporate hugger, and as he coming on board, and have a hug, and just trying to, and some of it is because I am like that, and some of it is about trying to get a culture going that is much more real. The idea that you'd walk into an organisation and not have a laugh and a chat and a bit of a flirt, and all those sorts of things, and that somehow or other, that if people are seeing you behaving like that, they think that isn't leadership. You think, but that's a distortion again of human life. This is human life we're talking about. We all spend all these hours and days and months and years together, and yet apparently when we're having a really crappy day, we can't give each other a hug and say, oh, thank you, I'm having a really miserable time. And to say things like, and I've study meetings very deliberately said, I don't know, what do you think? I don't know, get another bloody £10 million out of the organisation. What do you reckon? And then have great long chats about that. And very deliberately trying to say, being the leader is not tantamount to me being the cleverest person, or the person who has all the decision-making right here. And very deliberately, when I took over, we used to have a corporate management board and a management team. I've merged them into one and said, this is the principal decision-making team. So the 25 of us who are heads of services will make this decision. And once in a blue moon, I'll have to say, no, none of that works, we're going that direction. But most of the time, it should be about consensus, because we will all have a value to bring to this. And then just trying to get into, and I'm really liking the culture going where it's going at the moment in terms of what people wear. And what people wear is really interesting. If they get more and more comfortable with feeling they can just wear what they like, You don't have to have said wear what you like, because that never happens. It never works if you give an instruction. People have to do it because they feel it's okay. See what people were wearing when they did certain different cultural messages. Because certainly when I started in HR, you had to wear a blue suit with a white blouse, and you had to wear sort of relatively a skirt, and it always had to be a skirt of some sort or other, and sort of dinky shoes. And you can imagine dinky shoes on a 6-foot woman, you look like this, and not feeling very comfortable in either. And I remember thinking, I can't believe you have to wear a uniform to be an HR person. But everywhere I went, it was like that. You had to be wearing this certain thing. And certainly when I was in consultancy, where I joined, it was a relatively small firm, 20 of us, and all the women, it was very, very interesting that he picked up, the guy who owned it, all the women were about 30 to 35, and he didn't want any of us to wear a suit, but you had to be really well dressed. So had to have your nails manicured, had to have all of that kind of stuff. Because what he wanted was the idea that youngish women obviously go pitch sales to men. So when you go into most organisations, they were senior men. So the idea was that you were more or less going in front of them saying, you know, the subtext is, if you give me this huge contract, I will do things for you. and indeed, one of the directors did do things for me. and got lots and lots of work. But the subtext, which I found, and I gradually got this subtext, and looked around the office thinking, why is everybody quite pretty, quite tall, and they're all young, but all the men are in their 40s? And it clicked. And oh, I get it. Where the get out there and get the business, because you are hardly ever pitching to women. Because nowadays, when you get pitched to as a woman, it's interesting who they send along to pitch to you. They try and send young men. You think, no, I like old, grizzled men. It doesn't work. I don't want somebody who's younger than me. So the whole thing about how they try and pitch, because consultancies will work on the basis that they'll do their homework. Right, she's a 52-year-old woman, single, excellent, send in the 35-year-old cute-looking guy. I'm just going to check the time here, otherwise I'll go too long.
You're all right. I'll give you a 2-minute warning.
Thank you. Although I can waffle on for hours. Right, bring it back to how do you value female talent. I suppose the obvious answer is you've got to value all talent, because neither does it help anybody to be perceived that they are being given a leg up. It doesn't work. And I think it ends up being patronising. I think there's something about the clever line here about not patronising women, because actually women are just as capable of getting there and doing it all their stuff. What they need, what I need, different people, what I needed was not to be treated like shit, being blunt. What I needed was not to have people think that I got there because I slept with Charlie. And when we start the executive learning program, the leadership program, the twice now that I've been interviewed and people are there, and Charlie interviews me. Great, he was a really, really, really good sponsor when I joined the organisation, but you know, just he went off then to be the president, and I got on running the change, which is why I became chief, because I was doing so much of the change program. In the end, it was like, well, you carry on. So I always say to people, well, I'm not here because I slept with him. And everybody laughs, and you think, yeah, I need to say that, because one of the problems is that sometimes you will be thinking it. So rather than you thinking that you can think that thought, I will route you out and say I didn't do things for him in order to get this job. In fact, I got this job like anybody else gets the job by working hard, worrying a lot, and being massively anxious. But it's still a truth, sadly, and go back to this self-worth business. I do have moments occasionally when I end up thinking, can I do the job? Is there should I do this? Who do I turn to? Am I treating everybody right? Am I creating that correct culture? And I used to panic about that, and now I've just got more open about it. Now I just share that with the team and say, look, I have a whole day sometimes where I think sometimes to a certain extent it is the nature of being a woman, I worry a lot. And I just need to be able to share some of that rather than hiding it all away and slowly and gradually having a breakdown. So let's just kind of share what all this stuff is about. Only wonderfully to find that everybody said, yes, I'm a bag of nerves and wake up in the middle of the night as well. So some of it is about valuing talent wherever it comes from. And it is about removing the people that will think it's okay to treat people like shit. Excuse the language, but it's true. And to still find that people will have an orientation to you and to assume certain things about you because you are a thing is slightly ridiculous in this day and age, isn't it? And I know we're all guilty of it as well. If we were here in a slightly different day, I would do my whole lecture about how the brain works. But in very simple terms, I don't know if you're aware of this, but in the bottom of your spine, you've got certain different types of hairs. And what those are for is that if somebody is behind you, it sets up a mechanism that starts to tell your brain that somebody's behind you. It's to do that. It's to look behind. And we are set up with millions of security things, lots and lots of different security factors built into our bodies. And all of that is about recognising that anything is perceived as threat. And of course, the way our brain builds, anything that is perceived as threat is usually something that's different. And if they're very different, then in truth, obviously, it's clearly perceived as threat, and therefore we step back. And we step back in terms of our behaviour. And what can happen, you can see it at any time. I grew up in a very small village in Wales. So when I went to university, practically everything was different. Because if you grow up with about 12 people and 2 houses, there is no such thing as anything that's not different.
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Right, there's a ton of psychology into it. So the reality is there's something about saying, right, if all that stuff can be perceived as different, then how do you carry on getting organisational life to accept that different is good and that different allows it? And some of that does come back to toolkits. Helping people with things like, and one of my big things is skills. It's not to do tons and tons of stuff around leadership training, it's to do lots of stuff about project management. And I always say to people, learn your trade. The reason you get to be good is because you learn your trade. And if you're good at project management, budget management, and all those kind of technical skills, you'll be able to kind of sell yourself wherever you are. But the biggest single thing is allow yourself to be who you are, and that humanity, and then accept that everybody else will be who they are. And funny enough, all boils down to simple things like good manners. And I often say you could shortcut half a dozen courses by just saying, just be mannerable, just be nice, open the door, be kind. And some of that stuff is just be kind. And I spend most of my living days putting my arms around people, are you all right? Trying to send out letters, people coming to me, having conversations like that, a kind of mother figure to a certain extent, and then get very, very annoyed if I see people being unkind. And on the whole, I've now recruited my top team. I've got rid of the 3 people I perceived would be treating people badly. And I thought, you can't say an organisation is good if you allow people to stay who are rubbish, and they actually will treat people badly. So get rid of all the people who treat people badly. And in the meantime, certainly all my team, one of the factors that when I was recruiting was that they had to be basically decent human beings. They had to be kind. They had to be capable of emotional expression. They have to be capable of talking to people without making other people want to think, can you shut up? And there's a whole thing about women will do really well in that culture. Women will do well if they're allowed to be emotionally articulate, be able to say, actually, I need support, be able to give support, be able to be really good at forming partnerships. And in fact, we've never, ever had an era where women were going to do as well. Although it's equally true of emotionally articulate men, because everything about fire now is partnership, having to work with other agencies, having to connect to other people, having to sell ourselves into other people. And women are bloody brilliant at that. So if you're distorting your organisation into a shape which doesn't recognise that kind of talent and skill, then you'll never be as good as you should be. And I think hopefully, bringing it to a summary, the reverse will be that in 50 years from now, we shouldn't be having this conversation. We shouldn't need to keep saying, how do you promote female talent? We should be saying, how can organisations be really good to work in? How can they get everything that's good from the best people they can find, and then just let them be who they are? Just let them get on with it. Let's not even bother with the Frederick Taylor job descriptions. Let's just recruit people because they've got good strengths, and then let them get on with it. And some of the best people I've ever worked with don't know their job description. They just crack on. But they're allowed to crack on, feeling if they get it wrong, they can walk in and say, we just got it wrong, without somebody having a breakdown and saying, well, how dare you? And I think one of the things in the end, I do lots of things wrong, but one of the things I do right is if they do walk in and say it went wrong, I usually say, well, there you are, because you want to have a breakdown, you want to have to start screaming your head off, but you just say, well, there we are, it can't be helped. What do we do to get back around it? And then and that's the one thing I think in the end, that's going right. We're stopping people feeling that their wrongness means that they'll shrink back down again. I want to keep flowering up. And that's true of men and women, I have to say. But it's equal. I'll shut up, otherwise I'll carry on. Thank you very much.